So today you are in for a very special treat. Rachael Clinton Chen is on the podcast for 2 episodes in a row, and she is undoubtedly one of my favorite mentors.
She has been such a gift to you. I know you've spoken of it. If you had to use like 3 words just to capture who she's been to you, what she embodies or represents to you, what would you choose?
Well, the first one's a phrase, fiercely kind.
Okay.
She is the one who taught me that kindness has teeth.
Ooh, I like that.
It allows us to fight on behalf of someone and to use force when needed.
Yes, yes. And I love how she gets into the story, or you all, when you tell the story.
I would also call her deeply pastoral,
Okay.
and I would call her a warrior for people who are looking to heal.
Some of you may be familiar with Rachael. She is one of the co-hosts, along with Dr. Dan Allender, of the Allender Center's podcast. She and Dan co-host that. They've had all kinds of great guests on there. And she also was one of the founders of the Allender Center, housed out of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, which is a big influence in our lives and a place where we've received a lot of care and training and are grateful for.
And I also want to throw in that last year, Sojourners magazine chose her as one of 9 women that they charge with being the women who have shaped the church in 2024.
Wow.
So she is a leader in her own right.
9 women in the whole country. What's the impact or effect that you've seen or experienced when people get to hear Rachael and she's teaching or sharing out of her story?
Well, I will say, and I've told Rachael this, she is the reason that I am here today doing the work I'm doing. She met me in the pain of my story and with a hope of God's goodness to come in a way that no one had ever engaged me.
That was a big, big part of your journey towards getting licensed to be a
Going
therapist.
back to school, right? Yep. Yep.
I know my experience of her has been more in kind of a teaching context. She's a lead instructor at the Seattle School, so she's kind of helped shape the content and deliver the content of narrative-focused trauma care, which is pretty amazing and is a transformative experience for people. But how would you say people feel seen and cared for? You know, your experience, but what else would you add to that? You know, when you get to hear Rachael speak, what can you expect?
I would say Rachael bleeds on behalf of the goodness in other people. I have seen her rise to the occasion to challenge when that is needed. And I have seen her bring wisdom to narrate a person's story in language that allows them to get their head around what they're living. She has an uncanny ability to both be tender and very, very firm. Even in the history of the organization of the Allender Center, she has been a pivotal force of trying to bring unity and healing and growth.
We're like super excited. We can't even believe we got to have this conversation with her. It was a real blessing to us. We hope it'll be a blessing to you.
Also, I want to mention that this episode includes brief, non-graphic mentions of past suicidal thoughts as part of Rachael's healing journey. If this is a tender topic for you, we ask you to please listen with care. If you're in crisis or in need of support, please reach out to your counselor, your pastor, or use the 988 hotline. This is a private 24 hours a day, 7 days a week hotline where you can talk, you can use the chat function, or you can text. It's also helpful if you are a person walking with someone who appears suicidal. So 988 is a great resource.
And with that introduction, we hope you enjoy this part 1 of 2 and enjoy it now.
Welcome back. Today we are here with one very dear woman, Rachael Clinton Chen, who is the co-host of the Allender Center Podcast with Dan. And Rachael, you have also been in charge of curriculum. Now you're a lead instructor. You've been with the Allender Center from the beginning, right?
I have. Well, yes. And actually, I was doing the math the other day, and we're getting on in years now with that. So I'm
Yeah.
embracing my middle age arrival
Yes.
when I start
Welcome.
counting down the years. So
Welcome
Right.
to the
good.
club.
Yeah.
Welcome. Exactly. We're wiser. We are maybe closer to the wise women, but that's a little hard. It's beautiful
Yeah.
and it's hard, right? I've been having to think about what's my own theology around aging,
Yeah, absolutely.
and how do I age well as a woman
Yeah.
in the world I live in, right? Embrace my wisdom and embrace my aging body. So,
Yeah.
okay, so the other thing that I know to be true about you is you are not only a pastor who holds an MDiv from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, but you are a very pastoral presence. And I have said often that you are the reason, in many ways, that I sit here today and I have a private practice in Charlotte caring for people. And that is because in 2017, on a whim, I made my way to a story workshop.
Mhm.
And I was put in your small group. I don't know if you remember this story, but that was the year that the riot happened in
Yes, I do.
Charlottesville.
That's right.
And when I called, they had 2 spots left in the story workshop. And the person who was going to come and apprentice, I don't even know who that person is to this day, but someone was coming to apprentice and basically watch you lead the group. And they had pulled out because they lived in Charlottesville and said, I can't leave my community at a time like
That's right.
this.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
the people who answered the phone and took my name, I guess, had said, oh, just stick with Rachel's group. There's an opening in there now. And little did I know what that weekend would mean for me.
And can you speak to that? What did that
Yeah.
weekend mean
Oh,
for you?
yeah.
And then I want to get Rachel to speak to it as well, to the extent she has any
Yeah.
recollection.
Oh, yeah. I love speaking to it. So I came in as a lifer Christian, but one who never could internalize that God actually loved me. I had begged for it. I had behaved for it as much as I could. I had tried to be in communities that would bring that about. And I never could really move the needle. And so at that point, what I was doing was minimizing a lot of the pain I had suffered because
That's
I
right.
learned,
Mhm.
one, that I didn't have a safe attachment to God. And so to bring
Mhm.
him all the pain, I didn't really feel fruitful, even though I was told to.
Right.
But I would do it and then feel nothing. And so I was like, well,
Right.
maybe that's wrong with me too. And then I had somehow gathered, and I have, thoughts on this, but I had gathered that my suffering also isolated me in community because people didn't want to be that close to a lot of suffering because it highlights we're powerless. And so the conclusion I drew was my level of suffering is somehow my fault. Either God's really
Yeah.
trying to redeem me, or people don't want to get too close because it might rub off, or it doesn't show God is victorious.
That's right.
And so I came in making a story that now I see as very profound in my formation, really small. And I
Mhm.
remember you stood up and you said, I will stand between you and the evil that has come against you, and I will wield my sword. And, I know as well as you can't truly stop the forces of evil.
No.
But I had never been advocated for that way. And so to have your body positioned literally in front of me and to say, this is what I see. And you used some really, at the time, probably felt extreme to my little minimizing heart, but it was so true language that really captured the story's core.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you have any memory of that, but I shed tears for the first time over that story, even though I had told it.
Mhm.
It actually penetrated my heart that day. So yeah, tell me if you remember or what that is
Oh,
like even to hear me say.
yeah. Well, it actually does bring tears to my eyes. And I do very clearly remember you in that group, your story. And in some ways, yeah, like that memory does bring back into stark contrast for me. Why do I do this work? How did I get into this work?
Yes.
How did I get here? Because I did not set out to, I didn't even know who Dan Allender was. And I certainly, if you had asked me 25 years ago, I had to say 25 years now, because I used to be like 20 years ago. And I'm like, no, we got to start moving it back. I would like, if you had said trauma, abuse, I would have just been so confused. Or other people.
So those were not on your 15-year-old, your vision board when you were 15. There was nothing about, I will be a caregiver to people who are dealing with intense stories of harm.
No, I had a call to ministry. I was in the Southern Baptist denomination, so that was still very narrow and as to what that could be. But I think I am like most people, and I want to get back to you, Wendy. I just think I am one of those people that just kept saying yes to Jesus at like the small turns that probably, thankfully, weren't as revelatory as what they would lead to, because I would have been like, no,
stop the
not doing
car.
that.
Right.
If like a small example, like I started out in nursing in undergrad because I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to help people, that I could be a missionary and go around the world and share the love of Jesus in tangible ways. Learned really quickly, I'm not good with bodies. So switched to biblical studies. It was like one of those kind of, I really needed to be over here in this realm, but no one in my world was saying, you should study biblical studies as a young woman. That would be wise. My professors were saying, you should do this. So like little turns like that, going to the Seattle school instead of another seminary was actually coming out of working with teenagers and realizing all this knowledge I had wasn't meeting their deep needs of care, and that there were skills and tools I needed. So I was looking for a seminary that had a strong counseling program, because I was like, well, those people know how to take care of people, so that'll probably rub off on the MDiv program, right?
And those other people need it was also like, this will give me a tool for them.
Those
You're
other
not thinking,
people,
I would love to have that too. You had no category.
no. And so very quickly into my studies at the Seattle School, that got flipped on its head, which was probably similar to what you experienced, Wendy. And I think like in the group, right? Like when our stories are normal, we're never, this has been true for me working with people with just the most explicit, profound stories of abuse you could ever imagine. There's still something in us trying to hold on to our care providers. There's still something in us needing to minimize the horror because we need to feel some volition in the midst of it. So that's not an abnormal instinct, but I remember it's not always that someone comes into your midst who's just ready to do the work and is hungry. And all they need is a slight, the way I would talk about it as a pastor is like a hermeneutical shift. Like they just need a slight shift of the interpretive frame, like that just like slight shift that brings like the lenses into focus. To be able to say, oh, this truth I know in my body. And I experience this a lot with women coming out of the church or coming, from within the church. And I love the church. So I'm not someone who's like anti-church. I see this a lot with women raised in Christianity, especially coming from the South or coming from contexts where part of the socialization is you put on a story for everyone else to see. And there's a lot going on underneath. Just that sense you put words to, like, almost like I don't have permission to suffer. And so I don't know how to make sense of my suffering. And I'm cut off and I'm isolated and I'm exhausted. And for me, as someone who would say I'm a pastor by orientation, what I saw in you was a deep longing for God. And I felt that sense of, wow, the God you've been given is really small and really distant. And that's just true for so many of us. We're coming out of more rigid theological systems or dogmatic systems, or maybe the ways in which God has been imagined to us really is coming through like our primary care providers. So again, we kind of tolerate because we want to hold on to God. So we like tolerate these things that actually don't feel in any way life-giving or loving or comforting or connecting. And so I just remember really feeling the Holy Spirit say, don't be shy with this one. Like some people, you do feel like, I need to tread very gently. The hermeneutical shift we might make might only be a millimeter, and that's good, honoring, lovely work. And I take that really seriously, that we have to honor people's personhood and their capacities and what they're saying they want. And we see this with Jesus. Jesus asks a lot, like, do you want to be healed?
Yes.
And so not imposing on people something that maybe they're not even really asking for, but you were asking for like deep connection. There was a sense of there's a deep well in here that is needing another deep well like a deep calls out to deep kind of moment. And yeah, I do. I remember feeling in my body the horror and terror of your story, but seeing that you did not, that the way that you were told to survive in your story was to just make it about you, because nobody else really was responsible. It was nobody else's shame. And so that piece felt very clear. And then that the reality that as Christians, I do think, sadly, especially in the United States, and I think it's part of what we see now playing out on the national scale, when there's a refusal to engage suffering with honesty, when there's a refusal to be truth tellers about where we've perpetrated harm, we have to construct a God made in our own image. We have to construct a God who needs us to be okay, even though we have this like long biblical witness of one, a kind of truth telling that a lot of times I'm like, does this have to be in this text? This is a really toxic, terrifying story that I don't want to be a part of our story. I don't want people to know that like people who follow God were capable of this. Or lament, like, you know, if you look at the percentage of the songs and psalms and kind of the worship poetry of the Bible, like huge portions of it are lament, are crying out to God in the midst of our suffering. You know, like they're very rarely like, everything's cool and great, and if I'm suffering, it's my fault. And actually the one text that takes that on, Job, makes it very clear. Like,
that's not the redemptive
that's
element.
bad theology, Job's friends. That's really bad theology. So I just have a deep passion, I think, because of my own experience of getting to reconnect with a more true God in the midst, like coming out of profound suffering. I just have a deep passion to help people connect to a truer God, to kind of contend with the shadows and the bad theology that I, you know, again, I can make sense of, and I understand logically how we get there.
Can you say a little bit more about your journey? Like, kind of how did that happen for you then? Because you started a little bit, you're going, thinking you're going to be a nurse, and then you shifted to biblical studies. You're still trying to have impact on the world. Where did that shift happen for you? Or can you say a little bit more about it in terms of your internal world and your experience and those things sort of being stirred up to mold you into how you show up as a healer now?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I'm one of those people, like from a very young age, was drawn to helping people, was deeply moved by compassion to people, like loved. I mean, as much as I can say there was a lot of harmful stuff that came through my experience being Southern Baptist, also where I encountered Jesus. It's also where I got rich deposits of the biblical text. Like, I mean, you know, like I have these stories, like when I was 4, you know, telling my little best friend in the car who was starting to fit, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. You know, like not a helpful sermon, but, you know, like kind of a little preacher. But also as I got older, you know, and my parents would tell me that, I would be like, yeah, and fathers do not exasperate your children, you know, like really getting in there, wrestling with it. And I would say that I had I think the more I look at my story, I had a good enough spiritual formation in my earliest years. There was a lot going on in my home, you know, that would later lead me when I got to seminary, like other people need help. Other people have painful stories. I had to do some of that work, but it wasn't until my adolescent years that we kind of found ourselves in a very extreme fundamentalism style of church that so deeply distorted my sense of God, my sense of self. It was during that time that I was set up in a relationship with one of my youth leaders as a teenager.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
very dogmatic. There were very strict gender roles, kind of this wielding and weaponizing of power and control to manipulate, exploiting fear, you know, like a very like, you know, those people out there scapegoating, leveraging shame, lots of even domestic violence type behaviors from the male leadership towards anyone who questioned or, you know, was defiant against something that, you know, something like, why aren't the kids wearing seatbelts in the van on this trip? They're getting berated in front of everyone.
And all while they're holding it up as we've got the corner of the market on truth. We've got the way that is right. And we please God and better than other people subtly.
Absolutely. Things like I was student council president of my 2,500 person high school, and that was seen as giving into secular ways. So it's
my
like I kind
goodness.
of got asked to step out of youth group leadership. Like I basically had to choose, choose being like the, something of this youth leadership or whatever. So coming into college, I was still in that relationship. And so even the move to biblical studies was actually really, it was like, he did not want me doing that. Nursing fit really
No.
well with his youth ministry role. Also like biblical studies, like anytime I had a sense of self in this. So I could say my story very much was one of, I was not in my senior year, most likely to become a motivational speaker. It's like things like all along the way, people were like, they were saying without being able to say, you're so pastoral, like you're such a motivator, you're a motivator,
You
you're
have a
an
voice.
encourager,
You have a voice
you're
that we want to hear.
you have a voice, you're a healer,
Uh-huh.
outside of the church. Then inside of the church, we want your gifts, but also you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, you're not this, you're not this. And no one, not until I was in seminary as like a 27-year-old, did someone first say, I think you're really a pastor. And that's when I was going to try to switch to the counseling program, because I was like, well, I think I can make more money. Counselor. So I think I'm going to do that because I'm good enough at it. And so I think that experience, so part of what led to my own like redemptive experience with God was, by the time I got out of that relationship, I had decided I'm done with God, because so much of it was so like religious trauma. I would say spiritually abusive, in the sense that this youth leader was using like, God wants us to be together. So it wasn't that if I got out of it, I was going to lose this relationship, or maybe even I was going to lose this community that was very important to me. I was going to lose God. But by the time I got I was like, well, if God wants me to basically be an empty shell of a person, suffering to the point that I wanted to kill myself because I was so miserable.
Yeah.
It was like I had this moment of, if this is what God wants, I don't want God.
Can't be
like,
for it.
I think I'd rather go it alone, right? Like I have enough in me that I could still have a good life. I would at least live. And that feels more important right now than whatever this is. And there was something about that defiance of this really abusive system, and in many ways like an abusive God, that opened up this kind of, honestly, as cheesy as it sounds, 9-month period in my life on college. Like I said, yes to biblical studies. And granted, I want to say God was bringing people, like I had a nursing professor, who was like, you seem really depressed. Can you tell me what's going on? I start telling her dynamics of this relationship I'm in. And she was like, I don't, like, you're not, you need to know you're in an abusive relationship. And you need to get out. So there were these moments of grace that came along the way at every turn. And so I had this 9-month period of just very intense, like when I read like Jillian of Norwich, or, these kind of desert mothers and fathers, like, I had a very mystical experience of God. I look at it now and say, oh, it was like I got to be born again. I got to go back into the womb of God. Have those, those new attachments, basically like the severed attachments redeveloped. And so much of it was this emphasis on, I am a God of love. And that love really being nuanced. So, like powerful, death defying, not, docile, not permissive, but just things like, I'd be like, oh, God would say, I'd feel the Spirit say, read this verse, wake up and read this verse. And so I would read this verse. And then later in the day, I'd have a conversation with someone and that verse would come up. It was like cheesy things that for me were like, God is really with us. And not just in this kind of out here inaccessible way, but like in a deeply relational, like deeply embodied way. So, one example, I felt the Spirit say, and I was a Southern Baptist, and I was a good Southern Baptist. So like the Spirit talking to you about things like this, and it happened to me. That's how I felt called to ministry, but they were rare and they weren't something you talk about, right? You just needed the word of God. But go sit on this bench. And I'd be like, okay, I'm just going to do it. And a person sat down, and I had never seen this person on my campus before. And it was a small school. And I just was like, how are you? Are you okay? And they said, honestly, I've been thinking about killing myself, but I felt like I just threw out a Hail Mercy to God, and God said, walk this way. So it was just like these moments that I could honestly say I have not had similar experiences since then, like that intense. But God was so gracious to boot me up and be like, I'm going to show you again who I am. Now, I would love to
Yes.
tell you that just like drastically reordered all of my neural pathways and healed my trauma
What?
that I
It
was not
wasn't
aware I
it
had,
wasn't your
but it
Damascus
didn't.
moment or your Aldersgate moment where all was changed. No, but what you're saying, Rachel, what resonates, and I've heard you talk some about this story in different workshops, but what's striking me now about the beauty of it is what a loving God who says, I'm for you. You can trust you're hearing from me, and we're going to get the mediators out of it. And I'm a mediator
Exactly.
by training, by the way. I love mediation in general. But you had barrier people
Yeah.
who
Oh,
are
yeah.
saying, we will tell you what all of this means.
Right.
And how
That's
dare
right.
you suggest otherwise?
Right.
And you're bad for doing that.
That's right.
And it's hard to get extricated from that because they
Right.
also, like you said, they introduce you to scripture that you love. They brought you goodness. That's one of the things we wrestle with as we talk about our stories of harm. The people
Yeah.
who did the most profound harm that we now understand also brought some of the best goodness. And at times I want to say, yeah, I can't even see, forget the goodness. I'm sitting here just
Right.
wailing and feeling the harm, but both are true. How do we reckon with that? But I love the tenderness of God in just finding you individually and
Yes.
showing you, yeah, you got a voice, and yeah, you hear from me. Here we go, and inviting you on a new journey.
Yeah. And in some ways reaffirming for me that I mean, there was a lot of tragedy that came out of that youth group I was in. I mean, I've lost several friends to a lot of, I would say, trauma induced death. A lot of young people that didn't make
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not, I don't think it's just like random.
Yeah.
I think that when we get cut off from the source of life because someone says you don't get to have access to God if you don't talk this way or think this way or look this way or live this way, it has huge ramifications. So I think that, in some ways, that is why I've always had such a passion to help people. In some ways, exactly what you're saying. No one's ever put it that way, but to disarm the bad mediators in their internal world and external world,
Yeah.
and to give them permission and an opportunity to, one, be the mediators of their own story,
Yeah.
and two, have a different relationship with God, a different possibility of connection.
Yeah.
That is really disruptive, right?
Yes.
Because it's not, you have this awakening and then you just want to go back to the status quo, or that you can't unsee what you now see. And
Yes.
again, my story took many turns after that, and they still involved being set up in very power differentiated relationships with men in Christian leadership. It took a
Yes.
long time to get into my own story of understanding what's my trauma that I bear, and also what's some of the trauma of the system that I've been a part of.
Yeah.
But one thing that was just so very clear to me in that moment is so many of the people that the church was calling outcasts, uninvited, exiled,
Yeah.
were like the exact people that Jesus, if Jesus were here today,
Yes.
would be pulling to the center
Yes.
to disrupt the ways we do this thing.
Yeah.
To
Dignifying.
disrupt,
Yeah.
dignifying, expanding at every turn what we understand love to be and to mean, exposing our hypocrisy,
Yeah.
and not as a way to just shame us, but as a
Right.
way to liberate. To say,
To
like,
liberate.
you live a very split world because you think you have to keep these things in the shadows. And it's not that we're supposed to indulge in our brokenness,
Right.
but I'm just a huge fan. Exactly what you said. I think true healing comes when we're able to move toward wholeness or integration. And a lot of times we think healing looks like splitting off the parts of us that don't fit or are not good or are not honoring or whatever. But we made all these parts. They bear stories. We didn't become this way in a vacuum. And I think we see this a lot. I mean, when that splitting gets to be the main way of relating, let's say in church leaders, that's why we're seeing such an explosion of church leaders just being exposed with these huge, very dark, very evil ways of behaving that
Double
have
life.
kind of had come out sideways, but people have been able to kind of push it back in. It's why, what we see from the national stage being done in God's name that just really comes across as so hateful and small and fearful is the end result of trying to construct a life that the way you get to be holy, the way you get to be loved, the way you get to
Yes.
belong is by a rigid contortion to a certain image
Yeah.
that actually is not what God has called us to and asked us to be about. So,
Well, and it's not
I
liberation.
digress.
No, it's
But it's
good.
the opposite of liberation. So it's worth naming. It's a slavery of a new type, really,
Yeah.
to a different kind of image or a different
Yeah.
way of being that, again, is being mandated by something other than the voice of Jesus,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
And I think I want to use that as a segue to the last few years. A lot of your work has come to be around this idea of spiritual injury, spiritual trauma, spiritual abuse. And as a woman who loves Jesus, and speaking to you, who is a woman who loves Jesus, but has also seen how he has been, I'll just be clear, has been misrepresented by people who bear his name and are part of churches. I would just love to hear what has led to that passion. Some you've spoken to, but tell us a little bit about what the work's about, what you hope to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, so much a part of this probably developed when I went to seminary. And again, God has been so gracious to allow education to be a place to kind of reclaim my mind and to
Yes.
ask questions. And, not everyone has that experience in academia. Some people move toward a kind of existential crisis that, feels like they get lost in the sway. And I've just been really fortunate that it's actually been a very redemptive place. And, dealing with my story, my personal story, which involved elements of domestic violence, but being in a religious context that was confusing because the way we modeled love was after how we understood what happened on the cross. And so people in abusive dynamics being told, well, that's what love looks like. You endure abuse
You're
because
supposed to
that's what love
suffer
is.
because suffering is
You
how
know,
you share in the sufferings of
the
Christ.
suffering is the redemption and not,
Yeah.
So I had these big questions around and how we understand the saving work of God, which in theology we would talk about as atonement, has major implications for how we understand what it means to love.
Yeah.
I was a Seattle school, so they were like, write your main paper on your life's questions and your vocational hopes. And I was like, okay. And man, it was too much. But I think I've been living into it for 20 years now. I mean, what I tried to accomplish in 25 pages was not going to be accomplished. But I was just playing and think in some ways that's where my first sense of, man, our theologies can be abusive and they can actually be umbrellas for perpetrating and perpetuating more abuse. How do we wrestle with the truth without dissolving it or saying there's no truth? But also, So I think I actually titled my paper something like Liberating God from the, cycle of abuse and penal substitutionary atonement or something like that. I don't know. But it's like, okay, so I have this moment, right? And
Setting
I'm
him
doing,
free.
I get invited to be a part of the founding Allender Center team, which for me was like, what? I am a pastor. I'm going to probably try to get a job in a church. I'm not a counselor. I mean, the amount of times I was like, I'm not a therapist, because everyone that was a part of the founding team were therapists and clinicians.
And did they articulate why they wanted you? Was there a recognition of, hey, we think you're bringing something because you're not a therapist?
Yes. I mean, it was very much, we need a deeply theological frame to what we're doing. And we don't believe therapists are the only people who can do good story work.
Yes.
And we've seen you, offer really good care to people with nuance, with curiosity, with humility. So, it took a long time to accept, okay, I'm a part of the team. I mean, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, but getting to enter stories. And I've always been fierce. I don't think anyone who knows me would be like, oh yeah, Rachel, she's just really gentle and calm. Like, I think they would feel like she's kind of intense. But so I've always been a protector. I've always been like, fiercely protective of the vulnerable. Again, the more story work I did, I got to turn that energy towards myself, which has been very precious.
You've used the metaphor of stormborn, haven't you?
Yeah.
I think I've heard you speak to that.
Yeah, I would say, like I'm a stormborn sanctuary. I like to offer stormborn sanctuary. Like, I grew up in Oklahoma. You learn how to read storms. There were a lot of storms in my home, but what does it look like to create like a safe enough place for people who bring a lot and are really complex to land. And so the more I started doing story work, I found that like where I came the most alive is with people like you, Wendy. Like when not all like when a story of harm that hasn't been contended with is holding someone hostage, but when their faith structure and faith system is actually like partnering with that kind of bondage to say,
Yep.
yeah, keep that under locks. We don't tell those stories. You're wrong. You're being dramatic.
Too much.
You know, you think you're suffering. Think about these people over here, or God's not emotional, or God doesn't care, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's for me as I started noticing in story work where I felt like all of my educational training, like all of my story training, right? Like my life training to be who I am would just collide and connect in ways. And when Dan asked me in 2018, so the year after I worked with you, he said, hey, I'm going to do this podcast series on like something, I'm going to call it spiritual abuse, but like I'm really just talking about, when our spiritual frameworks or spiritual leaders, are perpetuating harm or whatever. And I was like, that's a weird topic, but sure, I'll join you. I mean, it really was like, I was like, okay, because he had asked me if I'd talk with him about spiritual warfare. He had asked me if I would talk with him. This was before I was the co-host. So it was like, This was like, I was being invited on as a guest. He had asked me to talk about erotic transference in pastoral. And I was like, these are weird topics, but what the heck? I'll come talk about it. Spiritual abuse, religious harm, church hurt. It was like I was like, okay, I mean, sure, I could talk about that. I was like, well, yeah, because I feel really compelled to work with people I feel like I'm here and they just can't see it.
Yeah.
And then I started telling you some of the story I told you. And it was like one of those lightning moments, where all of a sudden you realize that the reason you are so compelled towards these places of particular liberation is because it's your story.
Yes.
And it's not just a topic about, it's a topic you've lived.
Yes.
And
oh my gosh.
I think for me, that brought a lot into just clarity.
So my memories of that first story group that I was in with Rachael still bring warmth to my heart today.
What do you remember mainly about it?
I remember the way that she, through naming the rigorous intentions of evil in my life, opened the door for me to see a much bigger God. And I realized that while I kept evil small, I didn't need God to be very big to contend with it.
And it was almost like, as somebody like in relationship with you, as you were experiencing that, there were so many aspects of story that you had some language for, you had some awareness of, you had processed, but there was something different about both the truth-telling that she gave in using some strong but apt words to describe what you experienced, but then that I'm still struck by that physicality of you need somebody to stand with you and for you.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a tenderness in Rachael along with a tenacity that has allowed me to engage, I believe, who is the true, real Jesus, who is far more than a match for any evil.
And it's not like something that was contrary to or antagonistic to theology or thinking about theology or anything like that, but rather, I keep coming back to the word embodiment, which I would say that matches what I've experienced at the Allender Center, at Recovery Week, places like that, where there is just a physical manifestation of we see what challenges, trauma, difficulty, evil a person has experienced. And there's something powerful and healing in the physicality of joining together and being empowered to, as ourselves, or empowering somebody else to say, no more to that evil. Yeah. There's something that just thinking about things on an academic kind of arcane level can't really accomplish.
Right. And so we realized that you, as a listener, may have had something stirred in you as you heard this conversation, as you heard Rachael share her story. I am fully aware that the global theology that many of us assent to can fall apart in the midst of our own suffering. And those are the places where we grapple with God and try to figure out who He is and what our faith is all about. And those are the conversations that I have hour by hour in my office, where people come in and their hearts are broken and their hands are empty and they're trying to make sense of it all.
And so that's where this next episode is going to go. And we invite you to come back for it because we'll be talking about what do we do when the harm, when the hurt that a person has experienced really has to some extent come, in the context of church, in the context of how power sometimes is miswielded in church context. And a lot of us have stories that point to that. The stories that Wendy and I hear in the nurture context point to that a lot. And yet, what I really appreciate about Rachael is it's not a therefore reject all things spiritual, therefore flee from anything that looks or smells anything like that, but rather let's rightly name and identify where is power used rightly and well in Jesus' name on behalf of Jesus, and where are lines crossed sometimes, where have lines been crossed and people have been harmed. How can we hold fast to hope in Jesus nevertheless? And so we're grateful that you guys got to spend this time listening to this episode. We invite you to come back for the next one because there's more good stuff there as well. We look forward to sitting with you then.